So it's that time again when Saturn is leaving one sign and going into another sign, and it will be embarking on a whole new journey going through Pisces. From March 7th, 2023 until February 14th of 2026, Saturn is going to be transiting the sign of Pisces. It will briefly ingress into Aries in 2025, but it only goes into Aries for just a second, but then goes back into Pisces for the rest of 2025, and it won't fully leave Pisces until February of 2026. Saturn takes about 2.5 to 3 years to transit one sign, and in this video, I'm going to be going over what Saturn in Pisces means by going over what Pisces means, what Saturn represents, and how this Saturn in Pisces transit is different from all of the other Saturn in Pisces transits that we've had in recent history. And if you stick around all the way to the end, I'll be going over how this is going to be affecting each one of the zodiac signs. So if you don't know me already, hello, my name is Cam White. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm a professional astrologer. I do weekly horoscopes. I do delineation episodes, which is my podcast where I go a little bit more in depth about certain astrological things. And if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. If you like this video, give it a like and let me know what your thoughts about all of this are in the comments below. So first, let's do just a little bit of a recap of Saturn in Aquarius. I made a video about Saturn in Aquarius similar to this one back in 2020, which I'll have the link in the description below. But Saturn first entered Aquarius in March of 2020, pretty much right when the lockdown started. And that's really funny because that's so symbolic of Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn rules authorities, restrictions, and walls, and it entered the sign of Aquarius, society, the people, and there was all of these restrictions put on people and separating people from doing things. Saturn entered Aquarius from March of 2020, and it transited from April, May, June, and then around that June and July time, Saturn actually went retrograde and went back into Capricorn for the last half of 2020. Then at the very end of 2020, right before the new year, Saturn came back into Aquarius, this time with Jupiter, and there was a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. Some of you might have remembered the great conjunction that was talked about around that last election time. So then Saturn transited Aquarius all of 2021, all of 2022, and pretty much the first 2 months of 2023 up until March 7th. And that was a very distinctly difficult time. There was a lot of things that changed in this world during that time. And a lot of that can be associated with the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in Aquarius. However, something I want to talk about is Aquarius, the zodiac sign, is ruled by the planet Saturn. So Saturn has been in its home sign where it has all of the tools that it needs to do its job most efficiently for the past 2.5 to 3 years. And more specifically, before that, from 2018 until 2020, Saturn was in the sign of Capricorn, which is also its home sign, where again, it has all of the tools to do its job. So Saturn has been in its home sign from 2018 up until 2023. That's what, 5 years of Saturn being in its home sign where it can do the most. And this is the first time Saturn will be in a sign that it doesn't rule since 2018. Now, that can be argued as a good thing. Saturn rules restrictions and authorities, and for a lot of people, Saturn transits can be very hard and very difficult. And as Saturn goes into a Jupiter-ruled sign, which is Pisces, things might lighten up a little bit. And that's because Saturn has to use the tools of Jupiter. The sign of Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, and so as Saturn's in Pisces, Saturn has to do its job, which is restrictions and limitations and discipline and maturity, but through the tools of Jupiter, which is through faith, hope, abundance, optimism. So I find this to be a really exciting time. But let's go ahead and first start talking about the sign of Pisces. So Pisces is a really interesting sign. It's very aloof. It's very weird. Some of my favorite celebrity examples of Pisces are Kurt Cobain, as well as Tyler, the Creator, Jordan Peele. And while they all have their own unique characteristics, because of course they're individual human beings, like Tyler, Creator is such a great example of someone who's really weird, really different, doesn't really care, is a little bit all over the place, is very aloof. And they're great examples of what the sign of Pisces really exemplifies. So first off, Pisces is a water sign. So the water signs have a lot more to deal with emotions, but something I like to talk about with Pisces is I like to call it the truest water sign. And that's because water can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. And that depends on the temperature of its environment. Something that people with Pisces placements really resonate with is their sensitivity. They're very sensitive to the people around them, their experiences, their environment, and depending on that environment, they can be, very cold and icy or very fluid and going with the flow, or they can be very, gaseous, very up in the air, very idealistic and all over the place. And that's also represented in the zodiac sign because not only is Pisces a water sign, Pisces is also a mutable sign. The mutable signs include Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. And what the mutable signs represent is the changing of the seasons. All zodiac signs get their meaning and significations from the seasons. Gemini represents the change from spring into summer. Virgo represents the change from summer into fall. Sagittarius season represents the change from fall into winter. And Pisces season represents the change from winter into spring. And so a good way to look at this in just a general term is the Saturn and Pisces transit will represent a lot of change. While Saturn being in Aquarius, Aquarius is a fixed sign. Not a lot changes. Everything stays the same. The fixed signs, which are Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, all represent the middle of the seasons, right? Taurus season, it's spring, everything's growing, not much is changing. Leo season, it's summer, it's hot, it's gonna be that way for a while. Scorpio season, after Libra season, when all of the colors change and all the leaves change on the trees, everything dies and we're in the dead of fall. And then Aquarius season represents the dead of winter. But to get a better description of Pisces, I want to read a quick passage from Paul of Alexandria, who goes over the zodiac signs in a very basic way. The 12th sign is Pisces. It's feminine, bicorporeal, and what bicorporeal means is that Pisces is represented by two fish. So the bicorporeal signs are like Gemini, for example. It's the twins. Another example of that would be like Libra. But because it's ruled by two fish, it's a bicorporeal sign. So it has to do a lot with duality. It's hibernal. It's the domicile of Jupiter and the exaltation of Venus. And this is important to note. Pisces is ruled by the planet Jupiter, and Jupiter is all about faith, hope, optimism, spirituality, abundance. And so a lot of those significations can be placed onto Pisces, and it's the exaltation of Venus. Now, exaltations are interesting. Exaltation is like, the way I like to put it is, if you throw a party at your house, you're in control of everything, but you're responsible for everything that happens if anything breaks or all of the messes. Versus exaltation is like when your best friend or a family member throws a party where you can still kind of do whatever you want, but you're not really responsible for anything. And a lot of your best qualities can really shine. So Venus is exalted in Pisces, which just makes this sign a little bit more focused on the benefic planets, right? Jupiter is all about hope and spirituality and faith and abundance. And Venus is all about pleasure. Venus is all about, fun and romance and connection and indulgence, which Jupiter also signifies overindulgence of things. So you could look at this as a much more fun sign. But it is the fall of Mercury. Now, Mercury is all about rationale, specifics, communication, and that doesn't really work that well in Pisces. Pisces is more about bigger ideals and fun and is not too worried about the specifics or the black and white text of everything. So you can look at that as Pisces being, again, much more of a fun-focused sign, a bigger picture sign, and not too worried about the details, not too worried about how things are rationalized. It is triplicity by day of Venus and by night of Mars. So Mars actually does pretty well in Pisces because it is of triplicity. Mars has triplicity in the water signs. It rules the soles of the feet and the feet in general, which is really interesting because in my delineation episode I did about the history of Saturn and Pisces, something you see a lot is both like Jesus stuff and occult stuff. And I bring up the Jesus part because the age of Pisces was really symbolized by Jesus Christ becoming much more prevalent in, the Middle East. And what were some of the things that Jesus was known for? Turning water into wine, feeding how many people? It was like 15,000 people with 2 fish, as well as the Jesus fish, if you know that Seinfeld episode.
You stole my Jesus fish, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right.
Is also a big symbol of Jesus. But what's interesting is he also, was some other stories of Jesus was, people washed his feet. He washed other people's feet. Something I like to talk about with the feet ruling Pisces is the feet are very sensitive. In fact, the feet can absorb so much. And, if you've ever been into grounding exercises where you put your feet on the ground, you get yourself much more magnetically connected to the earth. There's a lot of sensation and a lot of feeling and a lot of intuition you can gain from just your feet in general. And Paul of Alexandria ends with, the season of winter is completed in this quadrant, whence it is called water. So Pisces is a very interesting sign. It's very aloof. It's very all over the place. And it's a water sign. So it's very adaptable. It's very changeable in general. And that's different from Scorpio. Scorpio is a fixed water sign. So think of raging rapids. Think of sewers. Think of, stagnant water. But now let's go ahead and start talking about Saturn. So number one, Saturn is a malefic planet. And what the malefic planets mean essentially is they are bad or they can be troublesome. Mars is the other malefic planet. So Mars rules fights, conflicts, inflammation, severing, cutting, heating. But Saturn is a malefic because it rules walls, obstacles, restriction. It rules limitations. Now, I feel like people get really caught up in the difference between benefic and malefic planets. And one of my opinions is, just because Saturn is malefic, that doesn't mean it's not good. Like Saturn rules things like maturity, responsibility, discipline. It rules growing up. And those are all things that we have to learn as human beings as we get older and older. But I think at the end of the day, some of the most important notes about Saturn are restrictions. They are boundaries. They are walls. And so what you can kind of look at is there's the planet that represents restrictions, walls, barriers, discipline, going into the sign of Pisces, which is all about, again, fun, abundance, whimsicalness. But another way that we could look at this is Saturn is very dry and it's very cold, and it's going into this wet sign of Pisces where you're going to see some moistening happen. And think of your skin. Saturn actually rules the skin. And when it's dry and when it's cold, it gets very flaky and it gets very, not healthy. But when you moisten it up and you get some of that, water in the atmosphere, it makes your skin feel a lot more refreshed. So there's one side of this that I really like about Saturn going into Pisces. I think it's going to soften up the very hard extremes that we've been going through from really 2018, but mostly 2020 through 2022. Things have been very dry. Things have been very cold. Things have been very distant. And now that Saturn's going into Pisces, that's going to be loosening up. It's going to be softening up a little bit more. So I think some of the things to look for while Saturn's in Pisces is being more restrictive and a little bit more discerning about our beliefs, right? Pisces is very spiritual and it's very whimsical and very woo-woo. And as Saturn goes in here, it's going to be asking us to be more disciplined, to be more discerning, to be more restricted with our faith. And that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes with Pisces, we can be over optimistic, over idealized, and Saturn is asking us to be a little bit more realistic. As Saturn's in Pisces too, if Saturn's about maturity and discipline, and it's also the ruler of time, as it goes through Pisces, the sign of, again, spirituality, your inner beingness, your faith, this is asking us to be very disciplined with our faith. This is asking us to trust that. This is asking us to be more disciplined with that. If we have these hopes, if we have these visions, how are we actually applying these things? Are we actually being disciplined with those? And I think more for the world too, as Saturn goes into Pisces, Saturn rules structure, Saturn rules authorities, and you're going to be seeing that planet go into the sign of change, the sign of adaptability. And so I think you're going to be seeing structures and authorities and everything really around us kind of go through this change phase. Then, of course, once Saturn goes into Aries, Aries is a cardinal sign, so it initiates spring. And as Saturn goes into Aries, you're going to be seeing some changes beginning, or I should say new structures beginning with Saturn going into Aries. But these next 2.5, 3 years are really marked by changing the structures, changing our boundaries, being a little bit more adaptable and a little bit more fluid with them. Some of the things I don't like about Saturn and Pisces, though, I think there is going to be this kind of restriction on the way that we look at spirituality, the way that we look at our faith. And again, in my delineation episode that I did, I talk a lot about how there's this really big rise of, Jesus, as well as there's this, bigger rise in occultism. And Saturn rules, societies, and Saturn rules, again, organizations and structures, and it's going into the sign of faiths and spirituality. Something I also like to talk about with Saturn and Pisces is Saturn rules walls and barriers. And if you look at Saturn and Capricorn, a great example of this is the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall actually came up with Saturn and Capricorn, and it fell down with Saturn and Capricorn. And then with Aquarius, with Saturn ruling walls, there's been this societal divide, like a very invisible wall, a very intellectual wall between people. But Pisces, and Saturn and Pisces more specifically, I like to think of it as permeability. I've been using the analogy as of late of a cell wall. Think of a cell membrane in your body. The cell membrane's job is to keep certain fluids and lipids and proteins out and be very discerning about what it lets in. And as Saturn's in Pisces, you're going to see kind of these walls open up a little bit more, not free flowing, not breaking down, but being very discreet or discerning about what it lets in and what it lets out. So during this time, this is a time to be adaptable and changeable. And it's not just necessarily about bringing everything in and just taking everything at face value, but being more restrictive and being more disciplined about what you bring in and what you're going to be taking out. Now, the key difference with this Saturn transit is, again, this is not just an ordinary Saturn and Pisces transit. Saturn will be conjoining Neptune. That doesn't actually really happen till about the 2025-2026 time, but I want to talk about Saturn and Neptune being in the same sign and leading up to their conjunction. Now, that conjunction technically happens in Aries, but as they get closer and closer, the planet of reality and the planet of illusion and idealism will be together, and that's going to cause a few problems. So Neptune is a really interesting planet. Neptune rules idealism and media and illusion and fantasies and deception. So it's kind of all over the place. And one of the things to understand about Neptune is it's one of the outer planets. The inner planets, you could talk about Mercury being an inner planet, Venus being an inner planet, but there's a separate boundary between Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and all of the rest of the planets we can see with the visible eye or with the naked eye. And then the planets we can't see with the naked eye, which is Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are otherwise known as the outer planets. We can't see them with the naked eye. And what a lot of astrologers pretty much agree on is that they're much more of a generational influence. They're much more of a societal influence. You don't really see all the time the day-to-day effects of a Neptune transit. However, as we have Saturn entering the sign of Pisces, where Neptune is currently, you're going to see more of the Neptunian themes come up. Now, again, something I've talked a lot about, both in my weekly reports, as well as in my delineation episode, as well as over on my Patreon, I've gotten a lot more deeper into this. So if you want to support me, watch more of these videos, get exclusive content, go ahead and check out my Patreon. The Saturn-Neptune conjunctions represent big changes in media. In 1917, we had a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which was really around the first time that we saw a lot of colored movies coming out. Same thing with 1953, when we had another Saturn-Neptune conjunction. We saw colored television becoming more mainstream. And then in about 1989, 1990, we saw the invention of the Game Boy. This is something that my astrologer colleague, Drew Levanti, put me onto, and that really revolutionized, media. And as we have Saturn and Neptune conjoining coming up in the next few years, you're going to see a big rise in, again, augmented reality, virtual reality, how we place ourselves in media in general. But I want to talk about just Saturn and Neptune being in the sign of Pisces. Neptune entered Pisces in 2011, which social media was already around, but you really saw the beginning of Instagram, and you really saw, more and more people putting themselves online. And now that we're at the end of Neptune and Pisces, we're seeing how that's distorting our view of relationships and our view of the world. And it's interesting because Neptune rules, again, idealism, it rules fantasy, it rules illusion. You also see it rule things like synthetics. Saturn is going into this sign, and Saturn's about reality. Saturn is about discipline. Saturn is about cold, hard truths, and it's going to be with the planet that rules illusions and fantasies and mysticism. So what you're going to see over these next 2.5, 3 years is areas of your life that you have been very idealistic about, in one sense, in a negative way, probably coming down and maybe crashing. It's kind of up to you of whether or not you crash hard or soft land. But as Saturn and Neptune are in the same signs, our ideas of what we thought we believed and what visions of the world that were distorted are going to become very clear. Because as Saturn, the planet of reality, is conjoining the planet of illusion, there is both the sense of, what we thought was, something real coming down and getting the reality of it. But another hand of it, you can look at it as Saturn is reality and Neptune obfuscates. And so it might get kind of confusing of what is real and what's not. And these are all very meta questions. They're all very deep questions. They're not necessarily something we're going to be able to answer. But I think one thing that I can say out of this time is that it's going to be a very confusing time, and it's going to be very difficult discerning of what's real and what's not real. And a part of that too is both, tempering our idealism with a more realistic structure, but then also understanding, something that I like to talk about is when are things harmful and when are things helpful? And, when is it harmful for you to be idealized or have everything with rose-colored glasses in an area of your life? But then also, where do you need to maybe lighten up a little bit? Maybe where do you need to see things with rose-colored glasses to bring a lot more of that positivity into your life? And so I think these are going to be questions that we ask ourselves in these trials that we go through over these next 2.5, 3 years. And I will be making a video about some of my predictions about Saturn and Pisces, as well as my predictions about Saturn conjoining Neptune. But before I go into what the Saturn and Pisces transit is going to mean for all the zodiac signs, I want to make an important distinction. Now, in astrology, there's something called sect, S-E-C-T. And what that stands for is the difference between day charts and night charts. And in the difference between day charts and night charts, certain planets can be a little bit more harmful or a little bit more helpful. Now, take this with a grain of salt, just like everything else in astrology, and of course, apply it to your own chart and see how well it, resonates or works for you. But the big thing here is in people who are born in the day. So that is the sun being above the horizon in your birth chart. And if people that are born at night, the sun is below the horizon. People who are born in the day, Saturn is what we call your malefic of sect. It is a hardcore planet, but it is in favor of your chart. Saturn rules the cold and the night and the dark, right? But the sun is out. So it kind of tempers out Saturn's negative qualities. Versus night chart people who are born in the cold and the dark and the night, Saturn is your malefic out of sect, which is just a fancy way of saying Saturn is a lot more problematic for you. And the way I like to analogize this is Saturn rules authorities. You know, people with a day chart, for example, and of course, this is all dependent on where Saturn is at in your chart and everything like that. But just as an example, as an analogy, people who have a day chart, Saturn is like when you get pulled over by a cop and you're nice and respectful and they just leave you off with a warning. Versus night chart people, you can be nice and respectful. They're still going to write you a ticket. They're still going to impound your car. And you kind of have to learn the, virtues of Saturn in a much more difficult, hard way. So Saturn people, things like discipline and maturity are easier for them to lean into. And they kind of are assisted with it versus people in night charts have to learn things the hard way. They're given a lot more of a harsher lesson. And while they still have to learn to be disciplined, they still have to learn to be mature. It is taken on as a much more challenging event. I talk more about this in a video that I made just recently called What You Don't Understand About Your Birth Chart. I'll link it in the description below. Make sure you watch that. But now let's go over what Saturn in Pisces is going to mean for each one of the zodiac signs. Aries, Saturn is transiting your 12th house. The 12th house is kind of fucked up. It rules isolation, alienation, hidden enemies, your subconscious, fears, phobias, as well as self-sabotage. Now, Saturn rules over your 10th house of your career and your 11th house of friends. So as Saturn transits your 12th house, in terms of work and career, you might be spending more time alone, more by yourself. Maybe you work more from home if that's not already a thing for you. Maybe you're doing a lot of things behind the scenes or behind closed doors. But with friendships, you're probably going to be a little bit more restrictive of your friendships. The 11th house is all about friends and community. And as the planet that rules that is in your 12th house of hidden enemies, isolation, this is probably going to be a time of being a lot more discerning of who your friendships are. But during this whole time as Saturn is conjoining Neptune in your 12th house, this is a time to be more disciplined with being more okay with being alone and going within your mind and asking, where do I get in my own way? Where do I actually want to go? And who do I have to be in order to get there? And so while this can be looked at as a difficult time, it doesn't necessarily have to be. This is a time for you to be virtuous and learn, where you need to discipline yourself, where you get in your own way, and be okay with being by yourself, being alone, and spending that time alone with just thinking of better ways that you can be, again, a better person. Saturn's all about restrictions, and it's going through your 12th house of your fears and phobias and things like that. This is just going to be a time of re-examining the things that you put on the back burner and asking, where do you get in your own way? What things do you put on the back burner that you probably shouldn't? Because if you keep doing that, they will become more and more in your way. Taurus, Saturn is going to be transiting your 11th house, which rules friends, community, networks, groups of people. It's very public, but Saturn rules over your 9th house of spirituality, religion, astrology, higher education like college, as well as far distance travel, foreign languages, things like that. Saturn also rules over your 10th house of your career, your reputation, and your legacy. And over this past 2 or 3 years, you've had to deal with a lot of discipline, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of restrictions and limitations with your career. But now that's changing. And as Saturn goes through your 11th house, this is going to be about being more disciplined with your friendships, maybe even getting more older friends, asking you to maybe tighten your friendship circle and be more, friends with people that respect you, that are on your team. Because it rules your 9th house of, astrology, spirituality, higher education. This might be forming more groups and colleagues around, your education or people that share your spiritual beliefs. As well, with Saturn ruling your 10th house of your career, your reputation, your legacy, this next 2.5 or 3 years is going to be focused on gaining a network with your career, gaining, maybe you have over the past 2.5, 3 years, you got a bigger position, you got more responsibility, and maybe it's time to network and get to know other colleagues. And maybe, you have your work, you have your career, and then there's the connections that you make through that. And I think during this next 2.5, 3 years, it's going to be about making those connections and tightening them, not necessarily being super social and all over the place, but having a very tight, respectable group of friends that are both related to your beliefs and your education as well as your career. Gemini, Saturn's going to be transiting your 10th house, which rules your career, your reputation, your legacy. So this is going to be a very, very serious time for you guys. A lot of this is going to look like, gaining a bigger job, being more responsible in your work, becoming a position of authority within your work. So that might be getting a managerial role or some kind of, higher role within your work. Now, Saturn does rule over your 8th house of shared resources and other people's money, debt, inheritance, and death as well. And as your 8th house ruler is transiting your 10th house, this might be like having to be responsible over other people's resources for your career. This might be really utilizing other people's resources and kind of being in other people's business for your career. Saturn also rules your 9th house of spirituality, religion, far distance travel, higher education. And so maybe you get to actually start applying some of your education within your career. Maybe you get to start, doing a career that's more related to your spirituality, that's more related to your religion. Maybe you get to be traveling a little bit more farther for your job and for your career. But at the end of the day, this is really about becoming more responsible with your work, gaining a higher level of maturity and discipline within your work and your career, which this is going to be a lot of hard work, but it is going to pay off in the end. Cancer, Saturn is going to be transiting your 9th house. The 9th house is all about spirituality, religion, astrology, far distance travel like foreign countries, as well as foreign languages, colleges, publishing, broadcasting, social media. And as Saturn's going through this part of your chart, there's going to be a time for you to be more disciplined, more restrictive, and more mature in this area. So you might see yourself being more disciplined in your studies, more disciplined in your spirituality. But Saturn rules your 7th house of relationships and all important, significant individual relationships. So you might be seeing some very important friendships or very important relationships coming from your education or from traveling or from even online spaces. But Saturn also rules your 8th house, which is all about debt, other people's money, shared resources, inheritance, and death. And as thank God Saturn's leaving your 8th house, but as it goes into your 9th house, these topics around shared resources and other people's money is going into your 9th house of spirituality. So maybe you've taken out some debt for college and now it's time to actually start applying it. Maybe you have some fears around, traveling, or maybe you have some fears around, because the 8th house also rules like secrets and occult and stuff like that. And as that goes into your 9th house, maybe you start being a little bit less afraid and start actually being a little bit more interested in discovering. I find this to be a very good time for you to be disciplined in your beliefs and ask bigger questions about, what do you believe? What is your relationship to God? What is your relationship to the world around you? And how does that shape your beliefs? And this next 2.5, 3 years is going to be about, being more mature, being more disciplined, but also having more restrictions in this area, having more limitations that's going to call into question, what do you believe? Leo, Saturn's going to be transiting your 8th house. So the 8th house rules death, other people's money, shared resources, inheritance, secrets, and fears. And the 8th house is really weird. I've been thinking a lot about the Leo risings and this transit. So Saturn's going to be asking you to be more disciplined and responsible and mature about how you handle other people's money, other people's business. Saturn rules over your 6th house, which rules labor, employment, day-to-day activities, your health, and pets. So some of you might be seeing some struggles with your pets, but also when it comes to health, you might be seeing that change. I wouldn't necessarily look at this as bad, but maybe this is a time to really look at your health. What are you doing? Maybe investigate, alternative ways to, improve your health. But because Saturn rules your 6th house of work and routine, as that goes into the 8th house, you might find yourself being more responsible for shared resources and other people's money. But Saturn also rules your 7th house of relationships. And I've talked a lot about the Leo risings dealing with just like harsh walls in their relationships. Like a lot of you have been chronically single. And as Saturn goes into your 8th house, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to immediately find a relationship, or maybe you are in a relationship right now and it's been very difficult, but you're going to see your relationships change. Like, what do you value in a relationship? Maybe rather than being very Aquarian, where it's very black and white, you're either in or you're out, this is going to be a time of being more open-minded of how you perceive relationships. You might even be more responsible for other people's money and shared resources during that time. Maybe having to be, the breadwinner in this situation, or Another way I would look at it is, dating different kind of people, exploring your emotions around relationships. And while I don't necessarily see this as all of a sudden you're going to find the love of your life, I do see this as changing your perspective about relationships and really examining your fears, what you're afraid of, and kind of being more open-minded about it and being a little bit more, I don't know. The past 2.5, 3 years have been very restrictive with relationships, like just straight up again, like chronically single. And this just seems like much more of an explorative time where it's not about just letting anyone in that that you find fancy, but really asking the deeper questions about like, what does it mean to be in a relationship? What do you want in a relationship? But I would also say this is a significant time of relationships changing, as well as around that area being about shared resources, debt, other people's money. If you're in a significant relationship, how does where do you need to be more restrictive with their income, or if they have debt that you have to also help handle? Those are kind of the things that you're going to be looking at. Virgo, this one's really big for you guys. Saturn's going to be transiting your 7th house of relationships. The 7th house is all types of individual relationships. The most important one is going to be like your spouse, like if you're married, that will be a really big deal, but all types of significant individual relationships. Now, as Saturn goes through your 7th house, this is asking you to be more responsible, more mature. Are you ready to get married? Are you ready to lock it down? The other part of this, though, is Saturn rules restrictions and limitations. So you might see a lot more boundaries being in play with relationships, maybe having a little bit more distance in relationships. Like Saturn in Pisces it's not going to be black and white. It's like maybe having better boundaries in relationships, but also being more discerning about who you let into your life and who you associate with. Saturn rules over your 5th house of love, romance, sex, pleasure. And as the planet that rules, again, hobbies, fun, love, romance, sex, as well as recreation and self-expression, it's going to be going into your 7th house. So if you have, hobbies, or if you're an artist or a musician, you might be, collaborating more with a certain individual. You might be finding much more shared experiences with individuals. I think this is better for just love and romance in general, especially given the past like 5 years. But it's not like it's just going to be all fun. It's just asking like, what do you actually want in the relationship? And are you willing to be discerning about that? Saturn also rules your 6th house, which rules labor, work, routine, coworkers, employees. It rules health and pets. So you're going to be seeing a very significant relationship form between a coworker or an employee that you have. Because the 6th rule, again, rules coworkers and employees, it's going into your 7th house of relationships. This might be some sort of mentor, some type of teacher, some type of an authority figure that's going to be very prevalent in your life. This is also going to be a time, I think, of just learning from relationships. Like if you want to be better about your health, you want to be better about your routine, Saturn going into your 7th house might bring in some type of a teacher or some type of authority figure to really learn from this area. Libra, Saturn is going to be entering your 6th house. So the 6th house is all about work, labor, routine, health, day-to-day activities, pets, coworkers, employees. And as Saturn goes through here, this is going to be a time of a lot more restriction in this area, as well as discipline. So while you might be more mature about handling your schedule and being more restrictive about your time, you might have more limitations when it comes to, employment, and it comes to day-to-day activities, and it comes to health. And so I look at this as both, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It is what you make of it. But what it really is like, where do you need to discipline yourself on your labor and your work, as well as, being a lot more restrictive when it comes to, your health. Like maybe if you're like a gluttonous type person, being more restrictive about it. But Saturn rules your 4th house of home and family and living situation. And as that planet transits your 6th, there might be a lot more things related to your home life and work. So maybe that's like working from home. Maybe that's like, being, more connected to your home through work in some capacity. As well, Saturn rules your 5th house of love, romance, sex, vices, as well as recreation and hobbies. And so you might see a lot more creativity being implied when it comes to your work and your schedule and your health and your routine. This seems like a lot more fun than the past 2.5, 3 years of Saturn in your 5th house. You've had to be very restrictive of what is fun for you, what is recreational. And as that planet that rules fun, recreation, love, and romance is going into Pisces in your 6th house, a lot of that's going to be changing. A lot of that's going to be a little bit more fun related, but you have to be disciplined with it. You have to be more committed to it. Scorpio, Saturn is going to be entering your fifth house of love, romance, sex, pleasure, indulgence. This can rule vices like drugs and alcohol, as well as children. And so as Saturn goes through your fifth house, this is going to be a time of you being more responsible in this area, being more disciplined in this area. A lot of you will probably change your relationship to partying or drugs and alcohol, or maybe you're considering having children, or maybe you already have children. This is going to be a time of taking more discipline and responsibility there. Same thing with, creativity and self-expression, taking this area of your life very seriously and asking the deeper questions of like, how do I express myself? What does fun look like for me? Saturn rules over your third house, the third house I always call the junk drawer of astrology. It rules a lot of things, but it rules like your schedule. Like the sixth house is like habits and like your work schedule, but the third house is like, when do you run errands? What do you do in your free time? The third house is also about utilizing the knowledge that you already have. The third house also rules siblings, neighbors, aunts, uncles. And so as you have your third house, and it also rules short distance travel. And so as your third house ruler, and it also rules writing too. I know I'm going all over the place here. But as your third house ruler is in the fifth house, there's a lot of focus on like, how do you manage your time? And are you doing the things that are fun for you? What does fun mean for you? And I think you're just going to be changing your opinions on, what fun looks like, what self-expression, what are the things that you actually desire and want, and what time are you committing to that? That might involve a lot of short distance travel. That might involve a lot of family members. But Saturn also rules your fourth house of home, family, living situation. And so as your fourth ruler is in the fifth, this might be bringing a more creative, energy to your home and your family and your living situation. A lot of this might involve kids as well, because, your fourth ruler of home and family is going into your fifth house of kids. Maybe some of you have kids. But the way I would look at that is, having more fun within your home life, being more creative within your home life. Again, there is a focus on recreation, self-expression, but it's your fourth ruler. So there's something about the home and the family that's coming into context here. Sagittarius. Saturn is going to be transiting your fourth house of your home, your family, and your living situation. So as Saturn is going through your fourth house, this is asking you to be more disciplined and restrictive with your home and your family. So this might be, being more responsible, like buying a house. This might be spending more time with your family members. This might be having to be more responsible for a parent, or being more responsible over this area. Now, Saturn rules over your second house of money and finances. So you're going to see a lot of money things involved with the living situation. But because it's Saturn, it's about being restrictive. It's about being disciplined. It's about being responsible. It's about making do with what you have. And so there is a lot of the money that's going into fourth house. So maybe this is buying a home, finding a new place to live. This might be, again, having to be more responsible over a parent. Saturn also rules over your third house. And I always like to call the third house the junk drawer, because it rules so many things. It rules siblings, neighbors, aunts, uncles. It rules writing. It rules short distance travel. It rules like how do you run errands? How do you spend your free time? And another thing that the third house rules is, how do you utilize the knowledge that you already have? And so as Saturn's been in your third house, there's been a lot of focus again on technology, short distance travel, community members that are around you. Like the 11th house is much more of like friends and networks, but the third house is like, who are your neighbors? Who is around you? And as your third house transits the fourth house, there's something about, how do you manage your time? How do you utilize the information that you have and the knowledge that you have and apply it to your home, your family, and your living situation? Capricorn. So Saturn is going to be transiting your third house. The third house is the junk drawer of the chart. It rules short distance traveling, communication, like writing. It rules siblings, aunts, uncles. It rules neighbors. Something that I like to talk about with the third house is that it rules, how do you utilize the knowledge that you have? And so as Saturn is transiting your third house, this is really about applying the things that you know. Now, this is Saturn in Pisces, so this is being adaptable. This is about being mutable, but being a lot more responsible with your time, a lot more responsible and taking on more, again, responsibility when it comes to maybe, aunts, uncles, cousins, siblings, neighbors. The third house rules short distance traveling, so, maybe being restrictive of where you go. Maybe you're really restricted to your area of where you're at right now. The third house also rules vehicles, so maybe there's this kind of focus on that as well. But this is important for you because Saturn rules your first house of you. So for one, this is going to feel a lot more lighter than you have felt since 2018. Like since 2018, it's been all about like rigid responsibility, both in your identity and your body and yourself. Then from 2020 to 2022, it was just like money, 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 finances, resources, having restrictions, having to be more disciplined. But as your first house rulers in the third, it's like things lighten up a little bit and you have to be more responsible of like, okay, what did you just learn through all of that? And how do you apply that with a much more softer touch? But Saturn also rules your second house of your money and your finances. And do you know how to invest? Do you know how to manage your money? Do you know how to be more open-minded with your money? Those are a lot of the things that are going to come into play with Saturn and Pisces. Aquarius, Saturn rules your, Saturn's going to be transiting your second house of money and finances and resources. So you're going to have to be more restrictive, more disciplined and responsible over your money over these next 3 years. This is Saturn and Pisces. So this is about being adaptable. It's not about being rigid. But Saturn rules over your 12th house of fears, phobias, self-sabotage. And as your 12th ruler goes through your second, you're probably going to be learning some harsh lessons about where do you put your money, how do you spend your money, and how do you manage it, and what are the fears that you have around finances. Saturn also is the ruler of your first house, of your body, yourself, who like literally you. And so you are literally going to be really just focused on your money and your finances. Saturn and Pisces, being more adaptable, being more open-minded, and being a little bit more restrictive of where you might have idealized this area in your life. Pisces, Saturn is going to be transiting your first house, and this is a very big deal. Saturn, again, rules responsibility, maturity, and it's going to be transiting your first house of your body, yourself, your identity, your personality. So you're going to see yourself starting to become a lot more disciplined, a lot more responsible, a lot more mature. A lot of you Pisces could probably grow up a little bit in some ways. I say that with love. But it's Saturn and Pisces. It's not about like completely just, becoming an old person and becoming like, angry or mad. But, where do you need to be more mature? Where do you need to be more disciplined? Where do you need to take yourself seriously? Now, the thing is Saturn rules your 11th house of friendships and networks and connections. And as your 11th ruler goes into your first house, I think it's going to be much easier for you to make friends. Saturn has been in your 12th house of hidden enemies and, isolation. So you probably haven't had many friends since 2018. But I think as your 11th ruler goes through your first, I think you're going to have like a lot more friends. It's not going to be like these huge groups of people, but it'll be easier to make friends. It'll be easier to be, with a tight friend group. But Saturn also rules your 12th house, which rules self-sabotage, isolation, alienation, things that you don't like to recognize about yourself. And it's going through your first house. So it's kind of like the things that you don't like to recognize about yourself is going to be right in your face. And so I think this is a time of really acknowledging a lot of the areas where you get in your own way. It's going to be very obvious. And I think it's going to be a couple years of learning how to get out of your own way and become more responsible and mature with those lessons. So I'm sure a lot of you only just watched your rising sign and then clicked off. But if you're still watching this at this point, I want to know what your thoughts are about Saturn and Pisces and maybe some of your predictions in the comments below. Let me know how this resonates for you guys. I'm actually really excited for this transit. I think it's been a very difficult 3 years, very difficult 5 years. And so I'm just looking forward to this. So if you like this video, please give it a like. It really helps me out. Comment, let me know what your thoughts are below. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to my channel. I do a weekly astrology report. I make bonus videos. I also have a podcast called The Delineation, where I, pretty much talk about whatever astrological subject I find interesting and go into detail with it. If you're interested in supporting my channel, go ahead and check out my Patreon. I do a live monthly overview. Every month I do a live Ask Me Anything live stream on my Patreon. I have a Discord channel. So if you want to connect more with people that are into astrology, join the Discord. As well, if you're interested, get a consultation with me. I am open for consultations. And one of my favorite things is to talk to people on an individual level about what the astrology means for them and what it signifies. So with that being said, I love and appreciate